Vampire thread. I'm going to post anything and everything I can find about vampires. Speculation/real accounts/stories/random photos, nearly all will probably be art. I hope you will all join me. This is from some vampire sites. How to know if you are a real vampire. All of the traits below are accurate for more than half of all real vampires. All real vampires have at least 85% of them. In other words, if at least 85% of them don't apply to you, then you are not a vampire. Assuming that you are a real vampire, the fact that so many of these traits are accurate for you may shock you. 1. Do you have unusually pale skin? You don't have to be white to be pale. If yes, then cook up 1 or 2, depending on the size, medium rare steaks. The best way to do this, if, by the time you're done enjoying the second one, you have a new pinkish color throughout your body that you haven't had in a while, read no further, you are a real vampire. Humans can't digest blood, let alone get color from it, real vampires do. Note, the extra work involved in trying to eat medium rare or rare meat can cause a temporary pink color to the skin, which is otherwise known as being flushed. Temporarily being flushed is not the color that is being referred to when a vampire gets color from the blood in the steak. It takes a lot less human blood than animal blood to get the same effect, but animal blood is way easier to get. If you were white before and still are, you should see a doctor. Odds are you aren't a real vampire, you're just malnourished, and they can help. 2. Have you ever been told by professionals that you're lucky you survived an accident with only a few scratches or cuts? 3. Are you a naturally strong magic/energy user, self-taught, or self-realized? 4. As a kid, were you the strongest, smartest, or quickest kid in the class, and at around 16 years of age, maybe all 3? 5. Did your dad disappear from your life while you were at a young age? Note, 52% of vampires out of a large range of vampires have answered yes to this question. This includes people who believe they are real vampires, however may not really be one. 6. Do people often tell you that you look very young for your age, or that they would have never guessed how old you are? 7. Are you extremely energetic at night but around the time the sun comes up become extremely tired? 8. Are you a slightly quicker healer than most, if not a much quicker healer? 9. Do you have an unusually high tolerance to alcohol and other poisons/toxins? 10. Do you tend to switch between very social and antisocial frequently? 11. Do you rarely get sick, or when you get sick does your body recover quicker than most people? 12. Are your 6 senses more enhanced than most other people's, i.e. vision, hearing, touch, smell, taste, and intuition? 13. Do you have extremely good vision in the dark? How many times has someone said it's too dark they can't see while you were doing something like reading? 14. Do you tend to not be surprised or scared by the typical sudden loud noise in a movie, or things like that, because you sensed it coming? 15. Do you tend to react to things like catching a falling object or other normally unexpected things at an almost psychic speed? As if you were expecting it to happen? 16. Do you tend to get a high from human blood? When drinking someone's blood, do you tend to find yourself being able to do something that they could do, that you couldn't do, about 2 weeks after drinking it? 17. Are you sensitive to light or the heat from it? Ranging from getting a bad headache from the glare to burning very easily. 18. If, while your skin is white from lack of enough blood in you, do you bleed quite noticeably less than a person normally should, or more likely not bleed at all? 19. Are your nails clear like glass, yet very strong? 20. Is your bedroom the coldest and darkest room in the house? 21. How often do you look at the person that almost bumped into you and think you idiot, or people are so stupid because they didn't know you were only a couple feet away from them, because you always know when someone is that close to you? Which, when you think about it, you only know because you can sense when someone is that close to you. 22. Do you always feel a strong urge to travel? 23. How often does something smell so strong that you can literally taste it, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing? Note, when most people say it smells so strong that they can taste it, they only say it as a figure of speech. And the people that agree with you when you say it rarely can taste it. Think I'm wrong? Ask them yourself. 24. Can you hear a whisper from across a room? 25. Is there a dark-colored ring around the iris, color part, of your eyes? All real vampires have this, however not everyone that has it is a real vampire. 26. Is there a noticeably different color surrounding the pupil? Inner part of the color of your eyes. 27. Do the words come on outside, it's a nice bright sunny day, and there's a lot of people out, seem more like a bad thing than a good thing to you, as opposed to the guy who said it to you, saying it with a big happy smile. 28. Regardless of how normal you may consider yourself to be, do you tend to meet a lot of weird people that you quite often hit it off with relatively frequently? Keep in mind, normal is just a politically correct term for people that have no creativity. And definitely is not something to be proud of calling yourself. 29. Do you have a predator instinct that is so strong that it makes most people seem to act more like herbivores than the omnivores they consider themselves to be? 30. Does sunlight/bright light in general hurt your eyes and head, in most cases to the point of a migraine? But you can still go out in it. See point 17. 31. Do electrical appliances generally tend to hate you? Watches mess up often, computers malfunction for no reason, etc. 32. Are your dreams often extremely vivid and sometimes result in cases of déjà vu? 33. Do people often find you very empathetic to how they feel? 34. Do people usually either trust you completely or not trust you at all? 35. When you will things to happen, do they usually happen? 36. Does your mood have an obvious effect on the mood of others around you? Only count this if it happens to the people that can't see you. Especially on babies and animals like cats. 37. Were you born with a number of health problems, including heart problems that quickly went away on their own? 38. Having only half of the traits listed does not make you a half vampire, it makes you nothing special. The only difference between a real vampire and a normal human is one endogenous retrovirus, making it impossible to be half vampire. The difference between a normal human and an ape is 3 endogenous retroviruses, making it a lot more likely for someone to be half ape than it is for them to be a half vampire. It is impossible to be a half vampire, anyone that thinks otherwise is a total idiot. For the people in a tiny Serbian village, there is nothing sexy or romantic about a vampire. In fact, they are terrified that one of the most feared vampires of the area has been roused back to life. Rather than Twilight's Edward, the people of Zorazi fear that Sava Savanovic is lurking in their forested mountains of western Serbia. They believe that he is on the move because the home he occupied for so long, a former water mill, recently collapsed. Savanovic is believed to be looking for a new home. People are very worried. Everybody knows the legend of this vampire, and the thought that he is now homeless and looking for somewhere else and possibly other victims is terrifying people, Miodrag Vujovic, local municipal assembly member, told ABC News. We are all frightened. Vujovic said villagers are all taking precautions by having holy crosses and icons placed above the entrance to the house, rubbing our hands with garlic, and having a hawthorn stake or thorn. I understand that people who live elsewhere in Serbia are laughing at our fears, but here most people have no doubt that vampires exist, he says. According to legend, Savanovic would kill and drink the blood of the peasants who came to grind their grain at his watermill on the Rogasica River. Tour groups from around the Balkans would come to see the mill. But even tourism had its limits. We were welcoming tourists, but only during the day. Nobody ever overnighted there, said Slobodan Jagodic, whose family owned the mill for over 60 years. We were too scared to repair it, not to disturb Sava Savanovic, says Jagodic. It's even worse now that it collapsed due to lack of repair. Traditions die slowly in this part of the world. In the dark forested mountains of Serbia, Bosnia, Montenegro, Macedonia, and Croatia, many people still believe in vampires and take them quite seriously, says Dr. James Lyon, Ph.D., a noted Balkan historian who has done extensive research on the folklore behind vampires. In local folklore, vampires are not potential boyfriends. Rather, they are hideous, bloodthirsty creatures with red eyes and iron teeth that bloat when they feed, and are able to shift their shape, says Lyon, author of Kiss of the Butterfly, a historical thriller about vampires in Serbia. Savanovic has maintained his notoriety in modern Serbia. He was featured in a 19th-century book, 90 Years Later, written by Milovan Glisic, whose book inspired a 1972 horror film, Leptirica, Butterfly, widely watched throughout all of former Yugoslavia. More recently, Savanovic appeared in an award-winning book Fear and Its Servant written by Mirjana Novikovic. The Balkans have long established itself as ground zero for vampires when it comes to fanged folklore, and Serbia is a leader in this, according to Lyon. Vampires originated in Serbia, not Romania, says Lyon. The word vampire entered Western languages from Serbia in the late 1720s. Austrian forces returning from conquests in Ottoman Serbia in the early 1700s brought back vampire stories, which circulated throughout Europe, later inspiring Byron, Keats, and Coleridge, he claims. In 1730 to 1731, the Austrian army sent a military surgeon into Serbia to conduct autopsies on suspected vampires. He and other Austrian army officers wrote of their experiences, and these records still exist today, Lyon said. Documented reports of vampire-related activity continue to this day throughout the Balkans, the most recent having occurred in 2011 in Serbia. Back in Zarozje, villagers will have to be on their guard for at least 7 more months, because local legend holds that vampires are most active between Christmas and the Feast of the Ascension on June 7th. More on the Austrian army investigations into vampires from the article, Decomposing Bodies in the 1720s Gave Birth to the First Vampire Panic. How Superstition Collided with Public Health Concerns to Create a Modern Monster. By Karina Wilson, for SmithsonianMag.com, October 23, 2020. Link to article in description. In 1721, London curate Thomas Lewis, concerned about the mephitic stink of decomposing flesh seeping from overstuffed tombs into his church, published a pamphlet, Seasonable Considerations on the Indecent and Dangerous Custom of Burying in Churches and Churchyards. The noxious vapors, he believed, desecrated the space, distracting his congregation from prayer. Lewis claimed that the odors also caused diseases like plague, smallpox, and dysentery. Lewis's view of the dead as dangerous to the living was based in contemporary scientific thinking which, in the 1720s, hadn't quite broken free of medieval superstition. A few years later, on the other side of Europe, in the village of Kiseljeva, on the outskirts of the Habsburg Empire, locals similarly blamed a corpse for spreading disease, but via a radically different method of transmission. In July 1725, they summoned the cameral provisor, a health and safety official. Provisor Frumbald's usual concern in such situations was identifying the cause of the cluster of cases and preventing a full-blown epidemic. The villagers believed Petr Blagojevic, who had died 10 weeks earlier, was up and out of his grave and bringing death to their homes. The widow Blagojevic claimed her husband knocked on her door after the funeral, demanding his shoes before attempting to strangle her. Blagojevic remained active over the next 9 nights, attacking 9 more villagers. On waking, each victim reported Blagojevic had laid himself upon them, and throttled them. After suffering a mysterious 24-hour illness, they all died. As Frumbald detailed in his official report, the village elders had already made their diagnosis: Blagojevic was vampiri, the Serbian word for back from the dead. Frumbald's only job was to rubber stamp this conclusion. The villagers would take it from there. So, Frumbold conducted a formal autopsy on the exhumed Blagojevic. He recorded the appearance, and smell, of the corpse as completely fresh. He also noted the appearance of fresh blood around the mouth, supposedly sucked from the victims. With such evidence before him, he couldn't muster any objection to the villagers' plan of action, repulsive though it seemed. As they drove a sharpened stake through Blagojevic's torso, Frumbold witnessed much blood, completely fresh, gush from the ears and mouth. Further proof of undead status, if any was needed. In his report to the Habsburg authorities, Frumbold accepted all the indications were present that Blagojevic was indeed a vampire. At the same time, he refused to accept any blame if his superiors felt his conclusion was ignorant. He insisted the fault lay entirely with the villagers who were beside themselves with fear, and he did what he had to do to calm them down. His report made sensational newspaper copy, leading to the first printed usage of the local term, vampiri, which would soon filter into other European languages. Lewis's complaint and Frumbold's investigation stemmed from the same public health issue, the proximity between the living and the dead. This had been a problem since the beginnings of urbanization in 11th century Europe. Homes and businesses tended to be built around places of worship and their attached burial grounds. The church wasn't keen to change this, as inhumations, indoors and out, were a lucrative undertaking. Priests earned significant fees from delivering last rites and requiem masses, as well as selling post-mortem real estate. The closer to the living the better. Meanwhile, good Christians took comfort from knowing they would decay next to familiar people and places, inside a protective cordon of prayer and remembrance. But, as the centuries piled up, populations bulged on both sides of the graveyard wall and competed for the same urban spaces. When all the plots in a graveyard were full, as was happening more and more by the end of the 17th century, sextons added another layer, digging graves 2, rather than the customary 6 feet under. The bodies of the poor, or plague victims, were dumped, en masse, into pits. Most corpses were clad in only a fabric shroud, as coffins were considered a luxury. All it took for the dead to rise was a heavy rainstorm, a pack of marauding dogs, or a sloppy drunk gravedigger. Some were withered down to the bone while others appeared ruddy and well-fed, more lifelike than when they were gasping on their hollow-cheeked deathbeds. Medical science failed to explain these such post-mortem anomalies, but folk tradition had a name for the undecayed, revenant, from the French verb, revenir, to come back. The Slavic term was vampire, or upir. By any name, these monsters were believed to be the result of improperly observed burial rites or a suspicious death. Denied the proper ceremonies, unable to rest, they lurched from their graves, attacking relatives and friends who died in turn. The medieval cure was drastic: exhume, stake, decapitate and burn, before scattering the ashes in running water. As the Age of Enlightenment took hold, this gruesome solution started to look like superstitious nonsense, especially to Catholic and Protestant bishops keen to move with the times and away from witch hunts. By the early 18th century, parish priests were forbidden to carry out such arcane rituals. Nonetheless, the vampires persisted. When their reports of the returned dead fell on deaf ears at the bishop's palace, tax-paying parishioners called their local government representatives. In late 1731, Austro-Hungarian regimental field surgeon Johannes Fluckinger journeyed to the Serbian village of Medgaja, around 120 miles from Kiseljevo, on the Ottoman border, to investigate another series of mysterious deaths. This time the suspected vampire zero was an Albanian named Arnold Paole. When he was alive, Paole claimed he had protected himself from a vampire's bite by eating dirt from its tomb and cleansing himself with its blood. Unfortunately, these precautions didn't prevent him from breaking his neck when he fell off a hay wagon. 40 days after his demise, 4 villagers declared the deceased Paole had returned to torment them, and then those 4 promptly expired. The local elders, advised by their administrator, or hadnak, who clearly had past experience in such matters, disinterred Paole's corpse and found it complete and incorrupt, while, completely fresh blood flowed from his eyes, ears, and nose. Satisfied by the evidence, the locals drove a stake through the torso, whereupon he let out a noticeable groan and bled copiously. All was peaceful for around 5 years. Unfortunately, Paole the vampire had also sucked on calves during his rampage. As the contaminated cattle matured and were slaughtered, those who consumed the meat also became infected, resulting in as many as 17 new vampires. An expert in contagious diseases, Fluckinger systematically ordered exhumations and conducted autopsies on all the suspects. In the interests of preventing an epidemic and further panic in the village, he sought a scientific explanation for their sudden deaths and the apparent anomalies in decomposition. Once again, he couldn't find any evidence of known diseases. Folk hypothesis trumped science as the most plausible diagnosis. Fluckinger classified each of the corpses before him as either decomposing or uncorrupted. Given his imperial loyalties, it's not surprising he tended to label outsiders, Turks or peasants, as vampires and had them dealt with in the traditional manner. Those from wealthier Hungarian families, like the wife and newborn baby of the Hadnak, were quietly reinterred in consecrated ground. In January 1732, Fluckinger's report, Visum et Repertum, seen and reported, ignited another furor. Debate raged in scholarly, religious and court circles regarding the nature of these so-called vampire epidemics. Could vampires be real, the end result of a messy death or funeral? Did citizens need to fear blood-sucking ghouls might attack them in their beds? In which case, was it safe to live close to a graveyard? Should, as Lewis and his cohort had long been suggesting, the dead be securely interred in high-walled burial grounds outside city limits? The issue wasn't laid to rest until 1746, when Vatican scholar Dom Augustin Calmet concluded in his dissertation Sur les apparitions that, scripture aside, nobody was rising from the grave. He classified vampires as creatures of imagination, rather than an immediate threat. Calmet's conclusion coincided with the birth of the cemetery reform movement, especially in France. If the breakaway dead weren't animated by supernatural forces, then sensible, practical measures would be enough to keep corpses confined to their tombs. While urban planners such as London's Christopher Wren advocated for cemeteries outside city limits as early as 1708, Paris led the legislative way, restricting burials in churches and urban churchyards in 1765. In 1780 the notorious Central Paris Cemetery of the Innocents, which had been quite literally bursting at the seams, was closed and emptied. The remains were reburied in catacombs. Lewis's vision of sanitary burial grounds was finally realized in the garden cemeteries of the 19th century. Père Lachaise was the first, opening outside Paris in 1804. With the dearly departed now secured out of sight and out of mind, people's once real fear of marauding corpses faded into the past. The vampires, thanks to their new fictional status, thrived throughout the 1800s. They were reclaimed in romantic literature as ephemeral, liminal figures, finding a natural home amid the elegant monuments of the new necropolises. They shed their former identity as barely sentient ghouls crawling from the fetid mud of urban graves and rose again as supernatural, superior seducers, the position they've staked in our hearts to this day. Now for a closer look at Fluckinger's report, Visum et Repertum. One of the most important sources for the history of vampirism is the report, Visum et Repertum, written and attested by military surgeons in Serbia on January 26, 1732. It was sent to the authorities in Belgrade and Vienna, and copied by envoys of foreign governments. Foremost, it was distributed in various versions to newspapers and scientific periodicals throughout Europe, causing a public, as well as scientific, sensation in many European countries throughout the year 1732. In fact, had it not been for this report, the word vampire and the stories of these supposedly blood-drinking corpses would probably not have become known, and consequently the popular vampire of authors like John William Polidori and Bram Stoker, as well as the vampire of 20th and 21st century popular media, would not have come into existence. A copy of the original manuscript is stored in the archives in Vienna, but the text is mostly known in somewhat different versions through various printed sources. Curiously, it has rarely been translated into English, and this is certainly also the case of the report from the first investigation of the vampire case in late 1731, and other documents commenting on the report. I have referred to this report and vampire case many times, but I think it's time to write a bit more about this document, the vampire case, and the historical background. Having defeated the Ottomans, the Habsburg Austrians entered a treaty with the Ottoman Empire at Pasaravic, Pozaravac, southeast of Belgrade in Serbia, in 1718, whereby parts of present-day Romania, a part of Bosnia and the northern part of Serbia came under Austrian rule. These areas that had recently become occupied were put under military jurisdiction. Due to the war, the area was very depopulated. The population did, however, consist of different ethnical groups, including the Ratsians, Serbs of the Orthodox Greek faith. The occupied areas in Serbia acted as an enlargement of the so-called militar grens, the military border, confinium militare, which was a buffer zone between the Habsburg and Ottoman empires. The zone was not only a buffer zone against military attacks, but also against epidemic diseases which had ravaged parts of Europe for centuries. In 1679, the plague had cost Vienna about 1/3, or 1/4, of its population, and as late as 1713 there had been a minor epidemic in Vienna. Epidemics were known to occur in the Ottoman Empire from time to time, and consequently it was necessary to stay aware of cases of epidemic deaths. So Austrian officials like military surgeons had good reason to be very cautious towards signs of inexplicable deaths. One case was reported to the commander of the Imperial Army in Jagodina, Colonel Lieutenant Schnezzer, by inhabitants of the Serb village Medgaja, Medveda or Medvedaya, in the fall of 1731. Along with the local militia, the so-called Hayduks, they complained of several mysterious deaths. Schnezzer consequently sent a contagions medicus, a doctor called Glazer, to Medvedaya to investigate what had happened. Glazer arrived in Medvedaya on December 12, 1731. Although he found symptoms from malnutrition caused by the fasting of the Orthodox villagers, he found no evidence of any epidemic disease. The villagers, however, claimed that symptoms like fever were the cause of the deaths of 13 villagers who had died within the past 6 weeks. They believed that the deaths were caused by bloodsuckers, or vampires, which had been common among the Ottoman Turks. Glazer could not persuade the villagers from believing this. In fact, they claimed that they would have to move somewhere else, if the authorities would not execute the vampires. Consequently, Glazer had 10 graves opened to carry out an autopsy of the corpses. Some of the bodies had decomposed, but others had become bloated and bloody with fresh blood flowing from nose and mouth. For this reason, Glazer found it impossible to persuade the villagers from believing that the corpses had become vampires. In his report to the authorities he asked for permission for the corpses to be executed, so the people could be calmed. Glazer's report was sent to the commander in Belgrade, who apparently decided to send a commission to investigate the matter anew. This commission was led by the regimental surgeon, Johann Fluckinger, and arrived in Medvedaya on January 7, 1732. They interviewed the villagers, who said that a Hayduk called Arnold Paole had died in 1727 from a fall from a hay wagon. While alive, Paole had often told that he had been harassed by a vampire when he was in another part of Serbia. To rid himself of the vampire, he had eaten soil from its grave and rubbed himself with its blood. But after some 20 or 30 days after his death, some of the villagers had complained of being haunted by Paole, who had become a vampire. 4 villagers were claimed to having been killed by him. To rid themselves of the vampire, the villagers opened his grave 40 days after his interment and found his body uncorrupted. Fresh blood was flowing from his ears, eyes, mouth, and nose, and his clothing and the whole coffin was bloody. According to the villagers, these were signs that he was a vampire, and they consequently drove a stake through his heart, which made his corpse groan and bleed copiously. Finally, the body was burned and the ashes buried in his grave. As the villagers believed that everyone killed by a vampire could become vampires themselves, they also dug up the corpses of the 4 people who had allegedly been killed by Paole, and treated them in the same fashion as they had Paole. Still, as Paole had also sucked the blood of cattle, the people who had eaten the flesh of those animals also risked becoming vampires. During 3 months in late 1731 and early 1732, 17 villagers, young as well as old, had died. Some of them had become ill suddenly and had died after 2 or 3 days of illness. The daughter-in-law of a Hajduk, Stanoika, had lain down to sleep healthy, but woke up with a terrible scream at midnight, frightened and shaking, complaining that she was being suffocated by Milo, a man who had died 9 weeks before. She then got a strong pain in her chest and got worse and worse until she died after 3 days. The villagers told this on January 7, 1732, to the commission consisting of Austrian military officials, including 2 subordinate medical officers. After interrogating the villagers, the commission went to the cemetery, exhumed and examined the 17 corpses. The minority of the 17 corpses had corrupted, whereas most of them were found in an, to all appearances, incorruptible state, with fresh blood within the body. This was also the case of the 60-year-old woman called Melissa, who was believed to be the cause of the deaths, because she had eaten the flesh of sheep which had been killed by a vampire. She had died after 3 months of illness and had been buried 3 months previously. Although she had all her life been skinny, much to the amazement of the villagers her exhumed body was fattish. In the cavity of her chest, fluid blood was found, and the intestines were uncorrupted. The above-mentioned Stanoika was, 18 days after her burial, found with a ruddy and lifelike face. Under her right ear was found a blue bruise of a finger. A quantity of fresh blood flowed from her nose when she was taken out of her grave, and fluid blood was found in her chest and heart. All the intestines, the subcutis, and her nails were fresh. After the examination of the bodies, the corrupted bodies were replaced into their graves, while the rest of the bodies were decapitated and burned by local gypsies. Finally, the ashes were thrown into the river Morava. On January 26, 1732, the medical officers of the commission described their findings and acts in the report Visum et Repertum, seen and found, and sent it to the authorities in Belgrade, who forwarded it to the war council at the court in Vienna, along with a request for remuneration of Fluckinger and his 2 colleagues. The council dealt with the matter on February 11, but more correspondence was necessary before Fluckinger and his fellow officers received their remuneration in November 1732. In the meantime, however, the report had been reprinted in various newspapers and journals, causing a large-scale debate in certain parts of Europe. This sensation was helped on its way by some of the people who were somehow connected with what had happened. As early as the very day that the Visum et Repertum was signed, i.e. on January 26, 1732, a standard-bearer serving in Serbia, von Kottwitz, wrote a letter from Belgrade to Professor Michael Ernst et Müller in Leipzig asking for an explanation of the phenomena observed. Glaser himself tried to attract some attention to his experiences by first sending a copy of his report to the Collegium Sanitatis in Vienna, and later on to his father, Johann Friedrich Glaser. Glaser Sr. wrote about it to one of the editors of the scientific journal, Commercii Literarii ad Ariae Medici et Scientia Naturalis Incrementum Institute, published in Nuremberg. His letter was published in Latin in the journal on March 22, 1732, and caused a debate on vampires in that journal which lasted for the rest of the year. Meanwhile, Karl Alexander Prince of Württemberg, who had been in charge of Serbia and Belgrade, was traveling to the court of King Friedrich Wilhelm I of Prussia in Berlin. Apparently, they discussed the Visum et Repertum, because the king asked the Royal Prussian Society of Sciences to state a verdict on the contents of the report. The society convened on March 7 and finished a statement on the vampires, or bloodsuckers, on March 11, in which they stated that all the phenomena that had been observed on the examined corpses could be explained by well-known natural processes. Particularly in Leipzig, but also in other places. However, the matter of vampires and how one were to explain the apparent incorruptibility of the corpses, the illness of the victims, and the claims concerning being haunted by vampires, were debated in numerous books and journals. Later on, the vampire case from Medvedgia was retold numerous times. The names of persons and places were changed along the way, so sometimes Arnold Paole became Arnold Paole, or Arnold Paole. In the middle of the 19th century, Herbert Mayo decided to try and use the romancing vein. To try and restore the original colors of the picture, i.e. he dramatized the story, when he recounted it in his letters on the truths contained in modern superstitions that were first published in Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine. It is this version that is more or less used by Dudley Wright and Montague Summers, and it is amazing to find that the original colors of the picture include a story of doomed love between Arnold Paole and his neighbor, Nina. Curiously, we are even told that it was on a grey morning in early August that the commission visited the cemetery of Meduegna, although we know it actually happened in January. The tradition of mixing up fact and fiction when it comes to vampires apparently is far from new. When it comes to the name of Arnold Paole, or however it is written, one theory is that the name was actually Pavel, and that Arnold was actually a title or description, namely that of Arnaut, a Turkish word for the people of Albania. Medvedgia in my opinion is the village Medvedgia close to the Zapadna Morava branch of the Morava River, not to be confused with the much larger city of Medvedgia that was outside the part of Serbia occupied by the Austrians in 1732. The legendary Arnold Paole. While you may have never heard of him, Arnold Paole was quite famous as a suspected vampire back in the 1700s, and he is still remembered in the Serbian areas today. Many people in the area still believe he was a real-life vampire even today. The real-life vampire story of Arnold Paole took place during 1727 to 1728 in the Serbian village of Meduegna. Arnold Paole was a soldier serving in the Austrian army, and he came home to his home village in the spring of 1727. But before he came home he said he was attacked and bitten by a vampire in Greece and he was able to kill it. But he told people in the Serbian village of Meduegna that he had started to feel weird and wake up at all hours of the night after being bitten by the vampire. He was not back home in his village of Meduegna for long before he fell off a hay wagon and busted his head wide open, causing his death. He was buried, and before long people in, and around, the village would claim to have seen Arnold at night in and around the village. It was said he went to many people's houses and they held their door closed and refused to let him enter their home. 2 people in different homes in the village were found dead with puncture marks to their throats. The villagers burnt those bodies and scattered the ashes to make sure they did not turn into vampires. 40 days after Paole had died, army troops arrived from Belgrade and they dug up Arnold Paole at the request of the village elders. When the casket was opened it is said that Paole was laying on his back, but as soon as the sun fell on him he screeched and rolled up in a ball on his stomach. The soldiers fired their muskets over and over into the casket and then they dragged him from the casket, chopped off his head, and burned it and his body to ashes and poured them into the nearby river. The vampire problems were then over in the village of Meduegna. Was he a vampire, or was he not? We cannot say for sure. It's up to you to decide. But this is one of many documented tales of a real-life vampire. The Vampire of Highgate Cemetery. Highgate Cemetery was constructed in London, England in 1839 as a burial place for the elite. After many years of neglect, the cemetery is now allegedly the home of a terrifying vampire. According to the Highgate Vampire Society, the sightings started in the late 1960s. A tall figure with red eyes was spotted and repeatedly reported, launching an investigation into the area and these claims. The strangest and most disturbing sighting came in 1971. A young girl passing the cemetery was attacked by a very tall, white-faced dark figure that threw her to the ground so hard that she suffered from scrapes on her arms and legs. Luckily, the shadow figure immediately disappeared when a car pulled up to the scene. The girl, who was in a state of shock, was taken to the police station and eventually told her own story. That story supported the sightings reported by so many other members of the community, and sightings of the vampire continue to this day. More on the vampire of Highgate Cemetery. The hunt for a vampire in Highgate Cemetery that led to a real magician feud. The 70s was a pretty crazy time, but these guys took it to another level. By Tilly Gambarato. It's been dubbed the creepiest cemetery in London, but it was also the site of a pretty hilarious series of events, in hindsight, admittedly. Local newspapers in the 1970s caught onto a story that would attract national attention. There was a vampire on the loose in Highgate Cemetery, and two men were competing to be the first to catch it. The cemetery, in North London, was the it place for the resting souls of wealthy Londoners in the 19th century. The graveyard is an impressive landscape of intricate tombstones, Gothic busts battling unruly ivy, and an A-list guest book of permanent residents including Jewish philosopher Karl Marx, and novelist George Eliot. By the end of the Second World War, the cemetery was in need of some serious TLC. It was run down, making it a perfect filming location for horror movies such as From Beyond the Grave, and Taste the Blood of Dracula, in the early 70s. But residents were experiencing a horror story of their own. Sightings of a sinister, dark figure with blood-red eyes who appeared to glide above the ground started cropping up in local newspapers. There was no other plausible explanation. It must be a vampire. One of the sightings was recounted in a letter written by young Wicca, pagan witchcraft enthusiast David Farrant and published in the Hampstead and Highgate Express. Farrant claimed he had seen a tall, grey figure floating in the cemetery on Christmas Eve in 1969, and that he had since found foxes in the ground with their throats slit. As president of the Psychic and Occult Society, it is no surprise that he jumped to paranormal conclusions. Shortly after Farrant's letter was published, a second man, Sean Manchester, was interviewed by the same newspaper for an article titled "Does a Vampire Walk in Highgate?" Mr. Manchester claimed that the figure was in fact a king vampire, a medieval black magician who had practiced magic in Wallachia, the home of Dracula, before being buried in the cemetery. His body, Mr. Manchester claimed, had been resurrected by a modern Satanist. And his demonic form now stalked the graveyard at night. Mr. Manchester, president of the British Occult Society, self-professed exorcist and vampire slayer, and alleged bishop of some unknown church, declared that he would be the one to rid the cemetery of the vampire. Farrant hit back, saying that the vampire myth had been blown out of proportion with the unhelpful influence of the media, and that the figure was in fact nothing more than your common garden ghost. Duh. In 1970 Manchester published The Highgate Vampire. Farrant came back with his publication of Beyond the Highgate Vampire. See where this is going? Proving that hell hath no fury like a magician scorned, the two developed a feud that continues to this day, and their antics around the Highgate vampire hysteria attracted the attention of the national press. Stories about the Highgate vampire got so out of control that on Friday, March 13, 1970, an ITV special report about the cemetery prompted an angry mob to descend on Highgate, determined to rid their town of the vampire tormenting local residents. Both Mr. Manchester and Mr. Farrant had been interviewed for the report, with Mr. Manchester taunting his rival by announcing that he would be leading a vampire hunt at the cemetery every night. Eager hunters lined the gates and climbed over the walls to witness the event. Despite police efforts to control the mob, several graves were opened and corpses were beheaded and mutilated with spikes, both on that night and during subsequent hunts. Although several hunters claimed to witness the dark figure in the cemetery, the cunning vampire remained unslain. Mr. Farrant and Mr. Manchester continued to compete, both claiming they would be the first to find and kill their undead neighbor. In a conclusion straight out of Harry Potter, the two decided to hold a duel to decide once and for all which of the two of them was the greater magician and paranormalist. Flyers started to appear in London Underground stations advertising the magical duel, which was scheduled for April 13, 1973 on Parliament Hill in Hampstead. Rumors swirled around the media that the two were planning to sacrifice a cat in the presence of naked virgins. When a local man's beloved pet failed to return home one day, Mr. Ferrant was villainized by the RSPCA and the media for allegedly having beheaded the animal as part of a pagan ritual. The duel never took place, and Mr. Ferrant was arrested in 1974 next to Highgate Cemetery carrying a crucifix and wooden stake. He was convicted of damaging memorials and interfering with the dead remains. But he successfully sued News of the World for making him look like a cat killer. And because a lawsuit is much too worldly for the likes of a magician, he also posted out voodoo dolls with pins stuck in the heads to an RSPCA inspector and others who had called for his prosecution, just for good measure. With no duel to settle the matter, the feud between Mr. Manchester and Mr. Ferrant is still alive and well, with Mr. Ferrant involved in the distribution of a line of comics called The Adventures of Bishop Bonkers, with accompanying Bishop Bonkers merchandise. Mr. Manchester writes several blogs aimed at vilifying his rival, describing him as suffering from narcissistic personality disorders and often illustrated with paintings of Ferrant as a demon. He also claimed that he had later tracked the vampire down to a house in Crouch End, where he had plunged a pike into its body and burned it. Thank goodness. Excitement around the cemetery died down, and now only history buffs are interested in visiting the graves. And if you're thinking that the Highgate vampire craze sounds like something out of a movie, that's because it is. Dracula AD 1972 was inspired by the bizarre events that took place there only 50 years ago. The Case of Anastasie Dieudonné. A report in the November 27, 1927 edition of the St. Petersburg Times relates the story of Anastasie Dieudonné. The young Haitian woman had apparently confessed to repeatedly drugging her 9-year-old niece and draining her blood through an incision between the girl's toes. The paper goes on to say that Anastasie was unbalanced and driven to the act by an uncontrollable urge. Although the case seems more psychologically based than most mysterious vampire accounts, the act of drinking blood from another person does qualify Anastasie as a vampire in the purest sense of that term. Vampires in the mountains of North Carolina. There are many stories of vampires and vampire hunts, all over Europe and the Caribbean. One of the best documented vampire stories ever occurred over about a year period in and around Dillsboro, North Carolina from 1788 to 1789. In the spring of 1788 a family arrived in the then small mountain community of Dillsboro, North Carolina. Their last name was Alford and there were rumors that they were descended from royalty. They bought land down by the river and built what was then a very nice large colonial home. Mr. Alford opened up a doctor's office and pharmacy in rooms in the front of the house, and people were at first really happy that a new doctor had arrived in their community. But very quickly 2 different men who had went to the new doctor to be treated for gout died. Both men had been well-liked members of the community and it really angered a lot of people. However, in a few months the local minister had made a peace in the community and for a time everything seemed to be fine. However, the time of peace was short-lived. That fall a young girl child of the minister was found dead in her bed with puncture marks to her throat. The minister's wife swore she had saw a dark form hovering over her daughter and she screamed, but it was too late and the child had died. This caused a huge uproar in the community and the people of the area started to claim a vampire or a group of vampires was loose in their midst. Many nights groups of men went out and searched but they found nothing. However, some men claimed to have seen a large black bat-like creature fly over them. A few nights later a young boy ran down the hill to his grandfather's house and told his grandfather something was up the hill in his daddy's house attacking his mom and dad. The grandfather summoned other men and they ran to his son's house up the hill, but the man, woman, and 2 girl children of 3 and 9 were dead with puncture wounds to their necks. The area was immediately in an uproar and soldiers were called in and they searched the community. By February of 1789, things had quieted down when one evening screams were heard, and when men arrived they saw a black form of a human run from the house and run down the hill and into the Alford house. When the village men went into the house where the screams had come from, they found the bodies of a young couple with vicious bite marks to their throats. Almost at once more men came, and they were told that the murderer had ran down the hill and into the Alford house. When the search party of men got to the Alford house, Mr. Alford refused to let them in. However, as soon as the sheriff arrived, they dragged Mr. Alford outside and tied him to a tree. When the men entered the house, they found some strange things for sure. There were bedrooms upstairs with beds, but it was clear no one slept in them. When the sheriff and search party got downstairs, they found 3 caskets, and Mrs. Alford, dressed all in black, was in one of them, but very much alive. She hissed and cursed at them when she was pulled from the casket. Later that night, the sheriff and the village's minister announced to the crowd outside the Alford house that the Alfords and their son were vampires. The Alfords were hung and then placed back inside the house that night. The house was set on fire and was burned to the ground. However, the couple's 15-year-old son was never found, and he was never seen in the area again. And there were no more vampire murders or unusual murders in the area. Were they really vampires? No one will ever know. But something very strange indeed had went on, and people at the time said that the Alfords were vampires. If the Alfords were not vampires, who was the vampire? Because something or someone was going around killing people and biting them on the neck. Buckinghamshire Revenant. The following by the Augustinian canon William Parvis, also known as William of Newburgh, or Newbury, born 1136, died 1198, concerns a haunting, or what is sometimes considered a potential vampire case. In these days, a wonderful event befell in the county of Buckingham, which I, in the first instance, partially heard from certain friends, and was afterwards more fully informed of by Stephen, the venerable archdeacon of that province. A certain man died, and, according to custom, by the honorable exertion of his wife arid kindred, was laid in the tomb on the eve of the Lord's Ascension. On the following night, however, having entered the bed where his wife was reposing, he not only terrified her on awaking, but nearly crushed her by the insupportable weight of his body. The next night, also, he afflicted the astonished woman in the same manner, who, frightened at the danger, as the struggle of the third night drew near, took care to remain awake herself, and surround herself with watchful companions. Still he came. But being repulsed by the shouts of the watchers, and seeing that he was prevented from doing mischief, he departed. Thus driven off from his wife, he harassed in a similar manner his own brothers, who were dwelling in the same street. But they, following the cautious example of the woman, passed the nights in wakefulness with their companions, ready to meet and repel the expected danger. He appeared, notwithstanding, as if with the hope of surprising them should they be overcome with drowsiness. But being repelled by the carefulness and valor of the watchers, he rioted among the animals, both indoors and outdoors, as their wildness and unwonted movements testified. Having thus become alike serious nuisance to his friends and neighbors, he imposed upon all the same necessity for nocturnal watchfulness, and in that very street a general watch was kept in every house, each being fearful of his approach unawares. After having for some time rioted in this manner during the night time alone, he began to wander abroad in daylight, formidable indeed to all, but visible only to a few. For oftentimes, on his encountering a number of persons, he would appear to one or two only, though at the same time his presence was not concealed from the rest. At length the inhabitants, alarmed beyond measure, thought it advisable to seek counsel of the church. And they detailed the whole affair, with tearful lamentation, to the above-mentioned archdeacon, at a meeting of the clergy over which he was solemnly presiding. Whereupon he immediately intimated in writing the whole circumstances of the case to the venerable Bishop of Lincoln, who was then resident in London, whose opinion and judgment on so unwonted a matter he was very properly of opinion should be waited for, but the bishop, being amazed at his account, held a searching investigation with his companions, and there were some who said that such things had often befallen in England, and cited frequent examples to show that tranquility could not be restored to the people until the body of this most wretched man were dug up and burnt. This proceeding, however, appeared indecent and improper in the last degree to the Reverend Bishop, who shortly after addressed a letter of absolution, written with his own hand, to the Archdeacon, in order that it might be demonstrated by inspection in what state the body of that man really was. And he commanded his tomb to be opened, and the letter having been laid upon his breast, to be again closed, so the sepulchre having been opened, the corpse was found as it had been placed there, and the charter of absolution having been deposited upon its breast, and the tomb once more closed, he was thenceforth never more seen to wander, nor permitted to inflict annoyance or terror upon anyone. The information above does not provide an accurate location for this case, and Buckinghamshire is a large area, so no map has been supplied for this article yet. The floating head and the entrails vampires. Southeast Asia laughs at your pointy-toothed walking corpses. Many cultures have truly horrifying vampires that consist of a flying head still attached to its spine and intestines. The Malaysian Penang Gallon is an intact woman by day and a segmented monster by night, her disembodied organs twinkling in the darkness like fireflies. Thailand's Krasu is a similar monster, one who will feed on feces and carrion if blood is not available. Vietnam's Ma Karang also detaches its head and spine, but is less vampiric, feeding exclusively on cow dung. But if a human interrupts its feeding, it will kill them. How to kill it? If you're aiming to kill a Penang Gallon, your best bet is to find her abandoned torso. Once you've got that, you can cremate the body or pour broken glass into it to keep the organs from reattaching. A more amusing trick is to turn the torso over so the Penang Gallon puts her head on backwards. The next day, everyone will know who the vampire is. The Penangle or Penang Gallon is a nocturnal vampiric entity of Malay ghost myths. Its name comes from the word tanggal, meaning to remove, or take off, because its form is that of a floating disembodied woman's head with its trailing organs still attached. From afar, it twinkles like a ball of flame, providing an explanation for the will-o'-the-wisp phenomenon. The Penang Gallon exists by different names in every country of Southeast Asia. It is known as Balan in Sabah, Liak in Bali, Kuyang in Kalimantan, Palasik in West Sumatra, Krasu in Thailand, Kaju in Laos, Op in Cambodia, and Manananggal in the Philippines. Though commonly referred to in its native languages as a ghost, the Penang Gallon cannot be readily classified as a classical undead being. Rather, it is a witch that developed the ability to take such a form through meditation in a vat of vinegar. The creature is, for all intents and purposes, a living human being during daytime or at any time when it does not detach itself from its body. In Malaysian folklore, Penanggal are mortal women who practice black magic. To become a Penanggal, a woman must meditate during a ritual bath in vinegar, with her whole body submerged except for the head. Only active in Penanggal form at night, the creature regularly soaks its organs in vinegar to shrink them for easy entry back into her body. The Penanggal thus carries an odor of vinegar wherever she flies, and returns to her body during the daytime, passing as an ordinary woman. However, a Penanggal can always be told from an ordinary woman by the smell of vinegar. The Penanggal was also mentioned in Hikayat Abdullah, written in 1845, much to the amusement of Sir Stamford Raffles. Modern urban legends offer alternative views of the Penanggal. This includes being the result of a curse, or the breaking of a demonic pact. One story tells of a young woman who was taking a ritual bath in a tub that once held vinegar. While bathing herself and in a state of concentration or meditation, a man entered the room without warning and startled her. The woman was so shocked that she jerked her head up to look, moving so quickly as to sever her head from her body, her organs and entrails pulling out of the neck opening. Enraged by what the man had done, she flew after him, a vicious head trailing organs and dripping venom. Her empty body was left behind in the vat. The Penanggalan's victims are traditionally pregnant women and young children. As traditional Malay dwellings were stilt houses, the Penanggal hides under the stilts of the house and uses its long tongue to lap up the blood of the new mother. Those whose blood the Penang Gallon feeds upon contract a wasting disease that is almost inescapably fatal. Furthermore, even if the Penang Gallon is not successful in her attempt to feed, anyone who is brushed by the dripping entrails will suffer painful open sores that won't heal without Obama's help. The most common protection against a penangle attack is to scatter the thorny leaves of any of the subspecies of a local plant known as mengkuang, which has sharp thorny leaves and would either trap or injure the exposed lungs, stomach, and intestines of the penangle as it flies in search of its prey. These thorns, on the vine, can also be looped around the windows of a house in order to snare the trailing organs. This is commonly done when a woman has just given birth. The shards of glass glued to the top of the walls around a house serve the same purpose, in addition to protecting against thieves. As an extra precaution, the pregnant woman can keep scissors or betel nut cutters under her pillow, as the Penang Gallon is afraid of these items. Once the penangle leaves its body and is safely away, it may be permanently destroyed by either pouring pieces of broken glass into the empty neck cavity, which will sever the internal organs of the penangle when it reattaches to the body, or by sanctifying the body and then destroying it by cremation, or by somehow preventing the penangle from reattaching to its body upon sunrise. Another non-lethal way to get rid of Penang Gallon is to turn over the body, so that when the head attached back it will be attached reverse side, thereby revealing to everyone what she really is. Unlike the Filipino manananggal, all penangle are females, and there is no variation in Malaysian folklore to suggest a penangle to be male. Another notable difference between them is that a penangle detaches only her head with her lungs, stomach, and intestines attached while leaving the body before coming back and soaking her innards in a prepared container filled with vinegar to fit back into the body. Also, the manananggal is usually described as having a normal human head. While the penangle is often described the same way, some also have fangs. Modern depictions commonly give it two fangs like a European vampire, but traditional descriptions have the fangs as more Rakshasa-like. Rakshasa is a supernatural being in Hindu mythology. As this mythology influenced other religions, the Rakshasa was later incorporated into Buddhism. Rakshasas are also called man-eaters. A female Rakshasa is known as a Rakshasa. A female Rakshasa in human form is a Rakshasa. The terms Asura and Rakshasa are sometimes used interchangeably. Rakshasas were most often depicted as shape-shifting, fierce-looking, and enormous creatures, with two fangs protruding from the top of the mouth and having sharp, claw-like fingernails. They are shown as being mean, growling like beasts, and as insatiable man-eaters that could smell the scent of human flesh. Some of the more ferocious ones were shown with flaming red eyes and hair, drinking blood with their palms or from a human skull, similar to representations of vampires in later Western mythology. Generally they could fly, vanish, and had maya, magical powers of illusion, which enabled them to change size at will, and assume the form of any creature. In the world of the Ramayana and Mahabharata, Rakshasas were a populous race. There were both good and evil Rakshasas, and as warriors they fought alongside the armies of both good and evil. They were powerful warriors, expert magicians, and illusionists. As shape changers, they could assume different physical forms. As illusionists, they were capable of creating appearances which were real to those who believed in them or who failed to dispel them. Some of the Rakshasas were said to be man-eaters, and made their gleeful appearance when the slaughter on a battlefield was at its worst. Occasionally they served as rank-and-file soldiers in the service of one or another warlord. Aside from its treatment of unnamed rank-and-file Rakshasas, the epics tell the stories of certain members of the race who rose to prominence, some of them as heroes, most of them as villains.